Hello, I'm Caldwell, and this is On The Money, a weekly look how to get the best out of your savings and investments. Before we start, I wanted to give you all a heads up that next week is our 100th episode, and to mark the occasion, I'll be joined on the podcast by Teddy Smith, fund manager of Fundsmith Equity. Before then, in this episode, we'll be discussing the growing reports about potential tax hikes in the government's first budget to be held on the 30th of October, which is the day before Halloween and threatens to potentially be a frightful one for personal finances. To tackle this topic, I'll be joined by Craig Rickman, personal finance editor at Interactive Investor. Of course, speculation about changes to the tax system are commonplace in the run-up to any fiscal event, but rumours have been running wild this time around, especially after Rachel Reeves revealed there's apparently a 22 billion black hole in public finances. Now, the Chancellor has indicated that tax rises are necessary in order to balance the Treasury's books. And further to this, a couple of weeks ago, Prime Minister Keir Starmer fanned the flames after warning there's a budget coming in October and it is going to be painful. So Craig, what else has sparked lots of rumours, and has the government given any indication about what taxes might be targeted?
So yes, potential personal tax rises are really hogging the headlines right now. Speculation sort of kick-started a few months ago when the election manifestos were published, but have reached fever pitch in the past month or so. So in this manifesto, the Labour Party pledged not to raise the headline rates of income tax, national insurance and VAT, and also promised not to raise business taxes either. Good news, of course, but the decision to omit wealth taxes, capital gains tax and inheritance tax from the document raised some eyebrows. Then, as you mentioned, in late July, Rachel Reeves revealed that there's this 22 billion black hole and indicated that tax rises are needed to help plug this. And more recently, Keir Starmer's budget comments have sent the rumour mill into overdrive. The government hasn't mentioned anything about which taxes will be targeted, but hasn't ruled some things out either. But the promise not to increase the headline rates for the main taxes has made things a bit tricky, as the Treasury gets a sizable chunk of its revenues from these taxes. To kind of give you an idea here, if the decision to slash national insurance at the past two fiscal events, last year's autumn statement and this year's spring budget, was reversed, this would generate around 20 billion, which would pretty much fill the so-called black hole. Problem solved, if you like. But as this would involve breaking a manifesto promise, I doubt the government will want to do that. So what does this mean? It essentially leaves them with three main options, which are capital gains tax, inheritance tax, and pensions tax. And that's where most of the reports are homing in on.
So let's talk through each of those. So in terms of capital gains tax, CGT, there have been some rumours and newspaper reports that CGT rates might be equalised with income tax. And of course, this would affect anyone with holdings outside of tax wrappers, like an ISA. And it would also impact landlords. So Craig, if that came to pass, could you run through the potential impact on investors?
So yes, So that's the big rumour with capital gains tax, the equalisation of rates with income tax. So under the current system of CGT, any profits on sales of investments above your £3,000 annual tax-free exemption are charged at 10% for basic rate taxpayers and 20% for anything that falls into the higher rate, which is when added to your other income, anything above $50,270. For sales of second homes, the rates are slightly higher at 18% and 24%. But equalising these with income tax would see the rates jacked up to 20%, 40% and 45%. This is the nuclear option. And if it did happen, interestingly, it would mean the UK would have the highest top rate of CGT in Europe. It's currently Denmark at 42%. There are various studies about how much this could raise, but some think that increasing CGT might not raise as much as the government might hope. In fact, there have been suggestions the CGT take could actually fall. And the reason here is that CGT is only payable once you sell something or gift it or transfer it. So if you keep hold of an asset, whether that's investments or a property, there's no CGT to pay. So, therefore people may hold off disposing of investments should the rates rise, for example, until CGT rates reduce in the future, which, they might do. There's clearly no guarantees here. Conversely, lower CGT rates may encourage more selling. So, if you're selling investments and you think, well, I might pay 10% or 20%, you might think, well, I can stomach that. But if it's 45 or 40, it might sort of put you off and you might hold on to the asset. So there's some thinking that actually, hiking the headline rates might prove counterintuitive. So that's sort of one thing that they could target, equalising rates. But what else could the government do with CGT? Well, it could cut or get rid of the £3,000 annual exemption. My personal view is, getting rid of it is unlikely, given this allowance has seen swinging cuts over the past 2 years. So it used to be 12,300. It was halved to 6,000 in 2023 and then halved again to 3,000 in April this year. So that's still an option for the government. They could also scrap the CGT exemption on death. However, this does have some complications, namely the prospect, when added to inheritance tax, of a double death tax. So any decisions here would require some thought. But whatever happens come the 30th of October, it seems likely we'll get at least some reform to capital gains tax.
So that's CGT. I wanted to next turn our attention to ISAs. So one thing we now do know for sure is that the British ISA will not be seeing the light of day. So this was a new type of ISA that the previous government came up with, and it would have given investors an extra £5,000 yearly ISA allowance to just invest in our own home market, the UK. Now, me and Craig, we did an episode a couple of months ago about what the proposed British ISA may look like if it was to be launched. And there were plenty of question marks at the time over how it would work, including whether all investment trusts should be included or whether it should just be those that just invest in or mainly invest in the UK equity market. But for me, and I know it's a view that you also share, Craig, the main sticking point with this British ISA was that it was only likely be a small number of investors that would utilise it, and it was only really be those that would maximise the current £20,000 ISA allowance each year. Instead, in my view, what would have a much bigger impact in supporting the growth of UK companies would be if pension funds reversed what they've been doing for decades and now started to increase their exposure to the UK. And related to that, there's a review that the government has kicked off that is looking at ways to boost investment in the UK economy, which is including looking at how certain pensions can invest in a wider range of UK assets. So on the one hand, the government needs and of course wants to support UK businesses, but on the other hand, it also needs to raise money to fill that black hole. And another item of speculation that's doing the rounds at the moment is that the ISA allowance could be tinkered with. There's been some reports that there could be a lifetime cap on ISAs at £100,000. Personally, I'd be very surprised if there was a lifetime cap introduced, particularly at such a low level, as this will disincentivise people from investing and saving towards their financial future. The reality is, most people are not investing enough towards their financial future. They need to be incentivised more rather than put off. And I also think having a lifetime cap on ISAs, it'll be difficult to administer. You're also penalising investment success and prudence, which would not be a good thing. And in terms of the annual ISA allowance, I'd also be surprised if that's tinkered with, as it's been at £20,000 a year for several years now. So it's essentially already had an official cap underway. Craig, what are your thoughts on these ISA rumours? And there's also some rumours doing the rounds about the dividend tax allowance and dividend tax rate potentially being changed. Could you also talk listeners through them?
Yeah, sure. So the reports of a lifetime cap on ISAs has been hanging around for a couple of years. The idea was proposed by the Resolution Foundation, a think tank. That isn't the last time we'll be discussing think tanks and their tax proposals in this episode. But yeah, my view is the same as yours. I'd be hugely surprised if we saw a lifetime cap on ISAs or if the 20,000 annual allowance was cut. But hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll move towards a simpler ISA landscape Things have become a bit complicated over the years. And yeah, I mean, I agree that we should be incentivizing people to save for their futures. So that's ISAs. Dividend tax. Some reports have suggested that much like the CGT rumours, that dividend tax rates could be equalised with income tax. So what are the current tax rates on dividends? So they're 8.75%, at the basic rate, 33.75% for the higher rate taxpayers, and 39.35% at the additional rate. So anything above 120,140 when added to other income. So if this came to pass, investors, shareholders could be affected, particularly at the basic rate, as income tax is 20%. So, the jump from 8.5 to potentially 20 would be sizable. There aren't loads of reports on this, so, we'll sort of wait and see what happens. Meanwhile, the dividend allowance, the amount that you can earn in dividends every year tax-free, that's seen some hefty cuts over the years. In 2017-18, it was £5,000. Today it stands at just 500, so a tenth of what it used to be. But there are rumours that Rachel Reeves, might cut it again to 250. So that's what some reports are saying. But I think we should note there seems to be a rumour for every nook and cranny of the wealth tax system, and it's quite hard at the moment to disseminate which of these have weight and, which are just pure conjecture.
So let's move on from Britain's favourite savings wrapper, the ISA, to what is often dubbed the UK's most hated tax, inheritance tax, or IHT for short. So while IHT receipts have been on the rise for a number of years now, mainly due to how house prices have soared over the past couple of decades, it's not a particularly huge earner for the government when compared to other taxes. So Craig, what might the government do here at the end of October?
So I think the first thing to say with inheritance tax, in my view, the government's core aim here should be to make things simpler and easier to understand, not just eke out some extra revenues. The current system is too complicated. There are some very legitimate arguments about unfairness, particularly around the tax-free allowances. So the whole thing needs a revamp. Further to this, like you say, IHT now raises around 8 billion a year for the Treasury, which, like you say, isn't huge in the grand scheme of things. It's less than 1% of the total tax revenues. From income tax, they rake in around 280 billion a year, and they get 25 billion from fuel tax. So any reforms are unlikely to make a huge dent in this so-called black hole. So what sort of options are open to the government? Well, there are a couple of things already in train. So Labour has pledged to end the use of offshore trusts to swerve inheritance tax, and the Conservatives propose to clamp down on nom-doms at this year's spring budget, a policy that Labour will inevitably push through. But among the other possible adjustments, the things that they could do, one thing that's been mentioned is an increase to the top rate, though that would be extreme given it's already high. It's 40%. They could also change the rules around gifting. At the moment, as long as you survive 7 years from the date that an asset was given away, it becomes IHT free. I guess they could lengthen that time frame. I'm not sure that would have any immediate effects on the tax system and tax receipts more specifically. Elsewhere, they could reduce the tax-free allowances, but some of these have already been frozen since 2009. The nil rate band, which is currently 325,000, have sort of remained that way from 2009 and will remain so until 2028. So it's already experienced some significant real-term reductions, which is, one of the questions around fairness. They also could end or cut certain reliefs, such as those afforded to farms and businesses. The latter could have implications for some investors, as qualifying AIM shares can attract 100% relief from IHT if held for 2 years. So that's an option. And finally, the government could target inheritance tax relief within pensions, which I know we're just about to come on to.
We are indeed. Yeah, it's the last topic we're going to cover in this episode. So it wouldn't be the run up to a budget without the usual speculation that pension tax relief may be reformed. Now, there's a recent report by the Fabian Society, a think tank, which proposed some controversial reforms to the way that pensions are taxed. The tax advantages of pensions, of course, are a core reason why people choose them over other savings vehicles to save for their retirement. Any reform to pensions tax relief could have a sizable impact on investors. So Craig, could you run through what this think tank has proposed and have the government responded?
So yes, the stuff or the proposals within this report are seriously controversial and radical. The Fabian Society reckons the reforms could raise 10 billion a year, which is around half the reported black hole. We should note these are proposals from a think tank, not the government, not the Treasury, and there's no indication at this stage that the government is taking these on board. But, and there is a but, earlier this year, a spokesperson for Rachel Reeves said she had no plans to change pension taxation, but stopped short of ruling it out either, which has sort of created this uncertainty. So what has the Fabian Society proposed? Well, there were lots of proposals, but I've picked out 5. If you haven't read about these yet, you might want to brace yourself. So the first is to implement a flat rate of tax relief on individual pension contributions, set at either 25% or 30%. At the moment, you get tax relief at your marginal rate, whether that's 20%, 40% or 45%. So under this proposed flat rate system, anyone who earns more than $50,270 a year would lose out, while those who earn less would gain. It may also create a bit of an admin headache for workplace pension schemes. So why might the government target this? Well, one reason is because more than half of the relief goes to higher and additional rate taxpayers who make up just 19% of employee taxpayers. That makes sense to me. If you pay higher rates of tax, then you're more likely to use the tax advantages within pensions. So for the government, it would be a way of potentially beefing up income tax receipts without breaking the manifesto pledge. Also seen as a way to support lower earners, but I think there are better solutions here, as I'll explain in a bit. So that's the first one. There are 5 proposals in total. So the second is to reduce the maximum tax-free cash from $268,275 to $100,000, or 25% if lower. So this would mean anyone retiring with pots of $400,000 or more would likely pay more tax in later life. It's also worth remembering that in the 2011-12 tax year, the maximum amount that you could take tax-free was $450,000. So it's already experienced quite a sizable cut, and that would be an even bigger one. So that's tax-free cash. The next is to charge employee national insurance on private pension incomes. At present, you stop paying national insurance once you reach state pension age, currently 66, whether you're still working or not. So this would increase pensioners' tax bills. So next, like we were talking about earlier, inheritance tax. So this Fabian Society proposes that pensions would be subject to inheritance tax and also apply income tax on all inherited pensions. So under current rules, pensions are exempt from IHT and there's no income tax if death occurs before age 75. So if this change came to pass, it would make it less attractive to cascade pension pots down generations. And, some people do use pensions for the IHT advantages. So we'll move on to the final one. This was slightly different. So the final proposal is to increase minimum employer contributions under auto-enrollment from 3% to 7% of earnings. So this would bring the total contribution amount, adding in the 5% employees pay, to 12%. Whether this increase should solely be borne by employers is perhaps a bit contentious, but either way, it's a proposal that we can see sense in. But otherwise, it's fair to say that these changes would be deeply, deeply unpopular. We have this looming retirement crisis in the UK where it's believed millions of people will reach later life with inadequate savings. And the risk is that if you erode the tax perks within pensions, then people will be less incentivized to save for their retirements. The tax breaks offered by pensions are generous. We can't ignore that. But some people perhaps wouldn't secure their dream retirement without them. It's what encourages people to save, or perhaps more accurately, it's what encourages people to save enough. So in my view, the government must tread immensely carefully here. If it wants to help lower paid workers, which is a vital thing to do, then increasing minimum auto-enrollment rates is likely to have a much bigger impact than bringing in a flat rate of tax relief that will ultimately penalise those who pay either 40 or 45% tax. So what's my view with the budget sort of looming? I would hope we don't see any changes to pension taxation. But if Labour does want to implement some reform at some point, then launch a consultation, look at all of the options thoroughly, including any unforeseen consequences, and then make an informed and considered decision. The pension tax system must encourage rather than deter people to save hard for later life.
Well, there's certainly a lot going on, Craig, and plenty to keep you busy in the run-up to the budget on the 30th of October. In the run-up to the budget, Craig will be reporting and analysing the latest rumours and the potential implications in terms of personal finances. So do check out our website, ii.co.uk, and you can sign up to our newsletter for free, which is sent each day. My thanks to Craig, and thank you for listening to this episode of On the Money. And if you enjoyed it, please follow the show in your podcast app and do tell a friend about it. And if you get a chance, it'd be great if you could let us know what you think of the show. You can leave a review, you can leave a rating, hopefully 5 stars, in your podcast app too. You can join the conversation, ask questions and tell us what you'd like us to talk about via email on otm@ii.co.uk. And in the meantime, you can find more information and practical pointers on how to get the most out of your investments on our website, which is ii.co.uk. And I'll see you next week.